Let's have a look at the modular synth. The modular synth is not the easiest synth to understand, but it's also the most powerful. If you haven't looked at synths before, start with the sub-synth tutorial to get a good handle on what an oscillator is, an envelope, a filter, and how these things work together. When you add a modular to your rack, you'll see an empty modular patch with squares indicating where the components can go. Each component either takes up one square or two, depending on the component. To add a component, tap inside one of these boxes, and you'll be brought to the component catalog. In here are different categories of components you can add to your modular. Let's start by adding the most basic one, the waveform generator. Now we've got a waveform generator, but to make it produce sound, we'll have to send in a note. This synth doesn't have a preview keyboard that's always visible. Instead, to give us more room to play with, we can toggle on and off for the preview keyboard. If you're adjusting things and the keyboard's in the way, just use the gripper here and move the keyboard up and down to place it where you want. Now, even if we press a note right now, even though the note is triggering, we're not getting any sound. That's because with the modular, you have to patch things. So to patch things, we'll press this flip button, and that'll show us the reverse side of the modular and its components. Up top is the modular itself with different outputs, one for note, note velocity, mod wheel. This is only if you've got a MIDI keyboard connected. We have outputs. This is the actual output of the synth that goes into the effects in the mixer in Caustic. A left output and a mono source if all you want is mono, but if you want to connect another source to right, you can send a different signal to the right side and you'll get a stereo signal on the output. Over here is a volume mod, and we'll show how to use that a bit later. So we've got our waveform generator here, and we'll notice it's got a bunch of inputs and outputs. The inputs are usually on the left side, and the outputs start from the right. So to connect an output, we start from the output port, tap and drag to where we want to connect it. In this case, I'll connect it to the left output or the mono output. And now we've got a sound. You'll notice I haven't played any notes and we still have a sound. That's because we aren't controlling this oscillator from the keyboard at all. In fact, if I play notes, nothing happens. It doesn't stop. So that's not what we want. To control the waveform generator so it only produces sound when we press a note, we've got to put in an envelope. So down here, I'll tap and I'll add a DADSR envelope. This is sort of like the ADSRs that are in the subsynth and most other synths. We'll just add this one for now. If we look at the front, this has standard attack, decay, sustain, release, and it's got an extra parameter for delay. So delay is a slight delay that happens before the envelope happens. So it's useful for things where you want it to come in later inside of the life of the note, but it's probably not very useful for just triggering something on the note. So what I'll do is I'll connect the output of that to modulate this waveform generator. Now if I connect the output, we have no sound. That's good. We press a note, we have sound, except all these notes produce the same sound. That's because we haven't hooked up the note signal. The note that comes in is just any other signal, just like the audio or control signals that would come in. So up here in the modular, we have the note control voltage, and we can feed that into things that produce sound like generators to control what note is produced. So I'm going to connect the note CV to the note input of this generator, and now we've got a basic synth. Let's flip it over to the other side and we'll have a look at what controls we've got on this generator. First up is the waveform selection. So we can morph between a sine wave, a triangle wave, a sawtooth, and a square wave. We've got octave, semis, and sense controls. And with this, we'd have a basic synth that we could produce a waveform. Let's say we want a triangle wave synth that just plays notes. We've got a synth that does that. At the back of the envelope are a few extra switches. The legato retrig switch, let's say we've got a tail on this envelope, so we've got a bit of release time. Because the modular is monophonic, each note that comes in preempts the last one that was playing, so we'll cut it off. What we can do, if we don't want the note to be very jagged, let's say we set this as sine wave, it'll be more apparent. You can hear the kind of clicking that happens. That's because the envelope is being reset very harshly, and we're starting from an attack time of 0 to get to sustain, but we're starting from 0. If instead we want to start from where the note was last playing, we can set the switch to legato, and that will start our envelope from wherever it left off on the last note, so that gives a smoother sound without any popping. We can control the slope of the envelope stages, the attack, the decay, and the release stage, using these three-way switches. Up would be a very harsh either entry or exit, depending on if it's an attack, decay, or release. In the middle would be linear, which is the default, and down would be an exponential ramp down. So in this case, let's set the release, which is the only one we've set, to exponentially ramp down, and that gives us a more natural curve, more like a real instrument would ramp. You can see it sort of cuts down pretty quickly and then settles nice and slow. That's the very, very basic of how to set up an oscillator, control it with an envelope, and hook up your note values and produce sound. So for now, what I'd like to do is go through some of the components, hopefully go through every one and give you a basic understanding of how they work. I might skip a few inputs and outputs, and you can consult the manual to find out how exactly they work. For example, I've skipped the inverted output on this envelope, but you can imagine that the inverted output is the same as the output except inverted. You can modulate an envelope using another envelope, and that gives you either sharper transitions, or you can use an LFO to modulate. All of these things are really open to experimentation, and there's kind of no wrong way to connect it. The worst that can happen is horrible sounds, but you know, this isn't a $1,000 machine that you're going to break by connecting the wrong thing. So do experiment. This synth is about experimentation. Before I go through all the components, I just wanted to have a look at the volume mod on the output here. If I play a note, and I'm playing on a MIDI keyboard right now, whether I play softly or hard, the same note's being produced. On most of the synths in Caustic, the note velocity reflects a change in volume. On the Modular synth, you get full control, so note velocity actually comes in as a signal. If all you wanted to do was have it control the volume, you can just connect it to that. And now if I play softly, and then hard, that will control it. But you're not limited by that. If you wanted to use the note velocity to control, say, the pitch on the oscillator, you can also connect the note velocity as a control signal. So now, if I set the pitch down to a bit, the softer I play, the less it's going to pitch it down. But if I play harder, so nothing's stopping you from using control signals. One output can go into many inputs. You just can't put many inputs into one output. If you want to mix many things and to go into one output, you need to use a mixer component. We'll get to that. So as our first setup, let's disconnect this because it really doesn't matter right now. We'll disconnect this because that's not what we want. Double tap, reset that. And I'll delete this envelope and use a simpler envelope instead. Now to delete a component, press the delete button and choose the component you want to delete, and that removes it. So now we've got nothing controlling this oscillator. It's going crazy again. We'll add a simpler envelope, one that only takes one slot, and we'll have it modulate our oscillator so we've got the same setup as before. Okay, let's go through the catalog. So I've already shown you what this one is. Let's go for the sub-oscillator. A sub-oscillator is very similar to this one. It's locked to a sine wave, and it can only produce lower octaves. Same thing, it's got a note input, so you want to connect that to your note signal unless you want a very fixed signal going in, and probably modulate it as well using an envelope. Now we've got no place to connect this. I guess we could connect it to the right side, but if we connect it here, that'll take out this connection. So what we need to do in this case, because we want to use 2 oscillators, is we'll set up a mixer. So I'll press here, go to the mixer, and use a 3-input mixer. This has 3 inputs, 1 output. Each input and output have gain controls. So now instead of sending this straight to output, we'll send it to input 2, send this one to input 1, and now they'll be mixed into the output and send the output into the machine. Now if I lower this one to a lower octave, you can hear how the 2 sounds are being mixed. The sub-oscillator is good for that. It kind of helps beef up the sound. If you've got a nice big synth, but it doesn't sound quite big enough, you can always add a sub-oscillator, and that gives it a little extra something. I'll disconnect the output of the sub-oscillator, and rather than have it mix into the signal, I'll use it to show you the FM modulation on the waveform generator. If I set FM modulation to nothing, we get our normal signal, and as I bring up FM, it'll use the output of the sub-oscillator to create FM. I've got sub-oscillator modulating on the normal envelope, but if I wanted something a bit more interesting on FM, I could place, let's say, another envelope, this time a decay envelope. The decay envelope doesn't have any sustain level, so it's just a one-shot trigger that starts decaying the moment the note starts. So if I connect that to the modulation source of this sub-oscillator, which is producing my FM, and set a little bit of a decay time, now what I'll get is the sub-oscillator will FM modulate this oscillator, but ramp down as it's playing. If I set it to the AM source, so AM can be used to create ring mod effects or to actually control volume. It can be used as an extra modulation source as well. If you connect the envelope to the AM, that's the same thing as modulating it using this one. And the pitch control I briefly showed you before, we could use the decay envelope here to modulate the pitch instead. Now this one's actually not needed. And let's say start like this, so we get sort of like the bend effect that's on the sub-synth. Or start from lower. Okay, so I've deleted the main waveform generator, and we're going to add another type of generator. Let's go for the pulse generator. The pulse generator is kind of like a square wave generator where we can control the duty cycle on it, which gives us pulse width modulation. It's got the standard note connections, modulation, and sound output. It's got this extra width input. So if we play it right now, we can play around with pulse width and see what it does. So this would be a good place to introduce the low frequency oscillator. We're going to modulate the pulse width using an LFO. So if I tap down here and add a mini LFO, this gives us a choice of waveforms and rate adjustments. And back here are the outputs. There's a 0 to 1 output, which is useful for things like width and controlling filter values. There's also a -1 to 1 output, which is useful for more kind of audio related signals. For this one, we're going to control the width using the 0 to 1 output, and we'll patch it into width modulation. And now we've got a PWM synth. We can taper down the amount of influence this has by using the width adjustment. Or in this case, the output of the LFO, same result. The LFO can be synced on the note start or on the pattern. So this would be on the note start and this would be on the pattern. This would also be a good time to introduce one of the useful components that's got nothing to do with the audio, but it's really useful for learning. If you go into the miscellaneous section, there's an oscilloscope component you can add. If you connect a signal to the oscilloscope, it'll show you visually what it is. So it's sometimes very useful for figuring out what's going on. So in this case, the pulse width modulation, we can actually see what it looks like. If we connect the output of this, which is the one going to our synth output, if we connect it to the input of the oscilloscope and play a note, we can see our square wave being modulated by this LFO. You can control the zoom on this. So the oscilloscope's really useful for learning how things work and seeing why your sound sounds a certain way. But it's 2 extra slots, so once you've got the hang of it, you can reuse those slots for something else and build a more complex patch. Let's delete this generator and replace it with another one. Let's use the FM pair. I showed you how to do FM using a sub-oscillator and the normal waveform generator. This one kind of wraps all of that into one. So you've got 2 oscillators, and let's connect their outputs. You've got a feedback control. You can modulate the FM and the feedback via inputs at the back. So if you use this LFO to control the FM, say. Or if you wanted to control feedback. Or even both. Now we'll delete that one and I'll show you the noise generator. Now this one's actually more like something you'd mix in with other signals, but I'll show you by itself right now. We'll modulate it using the normal mod input. And this one doesn't have a note input because it doesn't really matter what note you play, it's noise. So there are 3 types of noise: low frequency noise, pink noise, and white noise. Each one have a bit of a different spectrum. I'll tone down the output here because I know these are pretty harsh. If I connect it to the oscilloscope as well. So this is white noise, just noise in all frequencies. Pink noise kind of tapered down as less high frequencies, more kind of mid-low. And low frequency would be really, really low stuff. More useful for controlling other modules rather than producing output. You can see how kind of very, very low frequency it is. So it's more like a random LFO kind of thing more than an audio output. All right, now let's move on to filters. So for that, we're going to place in a waveform generator, set its output to a waveform somewhere between a sawtooth and a square so we get nice frequencies. Connect note, our envelope, and our output. And while we're at it, let's just connect our oscilloscope. So you can see how the waveform is sort of somewhere in between the two. And now let's place a filter. There's a couple different kinds of filters. These are very similar. The state variable filter is a filter with cutoff and resonance like most of them, except this one has a low pass output, high pass output, and a band pass output. They're all outputting at the same time, so you can mix and match the signals how you want. I'm not going to use that right now. I'm just going to use a standard, say, vintage ladder, which is a more standard low-pass filter. This one has 2 inputs and 2 outputs, so the 2 are kind of parallel. I'm just going to be using one, but if you want to use this for a stereo signal, it's quite useful. So I'm going to pass in the output into here, and rather than route it directly, I'm going to take the output of the filter and route it through. So now if I play, got the normal signal, and as I bring my cutoff, we're actually seeing the oscilloscope of the output of the generator and not the filter. So let's connect that and we can actually see what's going on. We can modulate the cutoff and the resonance on the filter using another source, so either an envelope, let's say we wanted a decay envelope to modulate the filter to get kind of like a little acid effect. Or we could connect our LFO. It's kind of different options there. I'll delete this filter and show you the filter that's not like the rest. This is the Formant Filter. What this does is it forms the sound based on resonant frequencies of human vowels. So if we take the output of this into our Formant Filter and produce the output here, and I'll route it through here, I guess. This works better with lower notes, so I'll pitch it down even lower. Now we've got 2 formants, and the formants are the actual vowel sounds that we're going to produce, and we get a morph parameter to go between the 2. So right now I've got this one kind of producing an A sound and this one producing an I. I'll go into an E, and now I can morph from A to E using the morph. So we can morph the gain using, again, an LFO or an envelope. This one's quite interesting, but it's definitely a standalone filter that doesn't sound like a normal low-pass, high-pass, band-pass filter, but it's a lot of fun. Okay, let's see what other components we have. Mixers here, I showed you the 3-input mixer. The 2-input mixer is the same as the 3. Well, obviously it's got 2 inputs, but it's got a modulation source. So if you want to use an envelope signal to modulate 2 signals at once, you can use that one. There's a 6-input mixer, and that one takes 2 slots. So you'll notice if I try to put it on this component slot here, the 6-input mixer modulator is not available because it wouldn't fit. Next we have effects. Delay is a slight delay in the sound. So you can see the note's been pressed, but it comes out later. We can use this to loop back on itself to get kind of a delay echo pedal effect, but it can be used for other things too. The main thing is it delays whatever signal comes in gets delayed by a certain amount. Saturator is a kind of distortion. And if we produce a more pure sound, higher up, and we crank the amount, so it's kind of this distortion effect. And now over to miscellaneous. So this gets requested quite often. This is an arpeggiator. This one's special. It doesn't actually connect to anything. It sort of meddles with the internals of the modular synth to control how the notes are played. Normally the modular synth is monophonic, but with the arpeggiator connected, or placed at least, and on, we can play more than one note at a time, and the arpeggiator will sequence them based on the sequence pattern we've chosen and how many octaves we want and the speed at which we want it to happen. So if I press, say, a chord, I should connect the output. So it's now going between the 3 notes that I've played, and you can play as many notes as you want. You can control the different kinds of sequences. And vary the speed. You can also have it choose random notes from the notes you've input. So the way you'd use this one in the pattern editor is rather than having each individual note, you actually trigger it to play as a chord. And then when you play it, it'll play these 3, feed them into the arpeggiator, and give you the output. Now I'll set something up to show you one of the miscellaneous components. If I use, say, this LFO component to modulate the amplitude of this generator, and I'll use a square wave to do it. You can hear it's modulating the output, but you can also hear it's popping. That's because it's a pure square wave going from on to off right away. So if we want it to sound a bit more pleasant, we want to smooth this out. To do so, use the lag processor. This is a dual lag processor. It's got 2 of them inside. If you connect the output of your LFO to the input of the lag processor and take the output and put it on your destination, you can now control the rate at which that signal is allowed to change. So the rate of change will kind of smooth out the signal. If we set the rate to full on, there is no change in the signal. But now if we bring the rate down a bit, you probably get something closer to what we wanted to do with this LFO modulating our amplitude. If you bring it really slowly, you can actually get it to look more like a sine wave modulation. But the lag processor is quite useful for slowing down anything that's happening too quickly. Any control signal like an envelope or an LFO that's creating pops, we can use the lag processor to intercept that. The other good use of the lag processor is for controlling notes, because notes are just a normal signal coming in. It's just a control signal. So if rather than sending it directly into the oscillator, we run it through a lag processor, we can go from this to something like this. So if we jump an octave, we can have that kind of glide in. So that's another good use of the lag processor. So next up we have the pan module. Now I'll hook my note up again, so I've got notes. And rather than send the output of the waveform generator directly to the output, we'll route it to the input of the pan block and send each of the outputs to one side of our modular output. So we're now going to get a stereo effect. To modulate the pan, we need to set a control signal. This is a case where the -1 to 1 signal of an LFO will give us pan. So in this case, -1 to 1 would be interpreted as the left side, 0 would be dead center, and 1 would be fully right. So if we set this output into this control, we now have... If you've got headphones, you can hear how that's going from left to right. The crossfader is kind of the opposite. It takes 2 signals in and gets 1 signal out. So if we connect the output of this, say, to here, and we'll set this one as one source. And for the other source, let's just put something that fits. Let's just put a sub-oscillator here. And we'll set the sub oscillator to quite a bit lower. And so now if we use the same control signal to control between the two, you can hear how it's going from the sub oscillator to the waveform generator and choosing between them depending on the LFO value that came in. The sample and hold block is a block that takes in a signal and sends continuously the same output sampled from that input signal until a new gate trigger has come in. The gate is either external or set via rate here. So for example, if we wanted to create something like the random waveform LFO, we could take a normal LFO, say sine wave, and connect the output to the input of our sample and hold and send the output of that to whatever we want to control. So let's say we want to control pitch here. So now if we play a note, and we'll route that to the output. So what the block is doing is sampling the sine wave coming out at a random or a predetermined rate value here and sending that out as the pitch. And if we take it faster and faster, eventually it becomes fast enough that we're actually sampling the waveform often enough to have it look like what it actually came in. So it can be useful on control signals, but you can also use it on audio and kind of send things around. The crossover splitter is a crossover like you'd have in a speaker or something. Takes in an input and sends out two parts of it, high frequency and low frequency. And the value at which the frequencies are cut is determined by this knob. So let's say we just wanted the high portion of this, and let's set up a waveform that's got more frequencies. So if we play a note, we're just hearing the high frequencies because we're cutting it down. By now we're getting almost all frequencies because we're only sending the very, very low bits to the output, which we're not using. The high output is getting most of our frequency content. And if we look at what's coming in on the low, so it's the opposite. So if you wanted to take a signal route just the low frequencies through directly and have the high frequency go through a filter, this is the block you'd use for that. So that's the run through of all the components you could use in your modular synth. Now obviously you get 16 component slots, so you can make things a lot more complicated than I've shown, but you can mix and match your components and interconnect and create mad patches if you want. Same as other synths, once you're done, you can save these out as your own presets. And same as the other synths, there's plenty of presets that come in. So good thing to do is sometimes just take a preset and have a look and study in how it gets its sound. And then see if you can replicate it or at least understand how it works based on what we've explained before. So looking at other people's work is a really great way of exploring how to get different sounds from the modular synth, but it's really open to experimentation, so don't let me or anyone tell you how to use it. Connect things and create your own sounds and have fun. That's it. So hopefully most of this made sense, and if not, you can always watch it again or come ask questions on the website, singlecellsoftware.com. I'll be happy to answer. So enjoy the modular.